Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly Sonar Market Insights webinar. It looks like we have about everyone logged in here that we're expecting for today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We hope everyone had a nice holiday weekend and wasn't exposed to too much volatility in the freight markets. And we're going to go over some of the things to expect and how you can read some of the data as it compares to what's happening around the holidays, as now we've seen several holidays that's in the Sonar platform. As we go through the webinar, as always, feel free to ask questions on the Q&A tab here on your screen share. Also, if you have a question after the webinar, you can always reach your Sonar account representative. If you do not have one, you can contact us at sales@freightwaves.com, or you can also go to our website, www.freightwaves.com/sonar. And without further ado, we are going to go ahead and get started, and Zach is going to intro a new index that we created that is essentially a combination of two volume indices that we already have, just hopefully now in a little easier way for you to read and for you to view on the platform. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Zach.
Thank you, Brad. So we now have the head haul index. Well, it's not totally live for those Sonar users that are in here. I'm actually in our development site right now, so we can show it to you. This did go live last week for a little while. We had some technical difficulties and had to pull it down. But we are about to put it back in there tonight around 10 p.m. So for the Sonar users out there that are looking around for this head haul index in their Sonar, it's not quite there yet, but I wanted to go ahead and show it to you live before we went ahead and put it back into the Sonar data. I talked about it last week, the difference between the OTVI, ITVI. I kind of showed you organically how we built it. The outbound minus inbound volume is really what we're measuring. And so I think for those of you in the transportation industry, you have this idea of the head haul, back haul market. That's kind of why we named it the head haul index. It doesn't necessarily mean that something's measuring whether or not it's a head haul or not. It's just the name that kind of fits with the idea of what we're trying to get at here. So essentially what we're looking at is something that gives you an indication of the amount of volume flowing out of a market versus the amount of volume flowing into a market. As anybody knows, there's no market that's always in balance, total equilibrium. At any given time, there's going to be more freight moving out of an area than coming in, and vice versa. And I have Seattle pulled up here initially to illustrate that a little bit more clearly. So Seattle is generally considered by most to be a backhaul market. What that means is, and at least from my perspective, is that there is more freight going into the market than coming out. And so a truck goes into Seattle and they essentially get stranded in the area. Brad, did you want to kind of
I think
give more color?
I think it's just important to know for the users that are transportation, day in, day out, whether you be broker, carrier, shipper, that, Zach mentioned, we're not claiming that this is an exact inbound, outbound, head haul, back haul market. Simply what we're showing is we're showing you a comparison of what's coming out of the market as opposed to what's coming in. And because this is kind of a market view of Seattle and it's not lane specific, there's a lot of other factors to take into account when viewing this index. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, that we're purely measuring the difference in the amount of freight delivering, the amount of freight with destination point in a region as opposed to freight with origin point going out of that region, or even with origin point in that region delivering in that region. And a little bit further, although it doesn't say specifically on this index, as you will see a lot with outbound tender volume or outbound tender market share or inbound tender rejection or outbound tender reject, they all have a combination of tender in that in that description. And it's just important to know that this index is created off of those same data, or that same data, so that these are daily updates with less than 24-hour lag, and it is coming from electronic transactions. So still a very real or near time look of how a market is changing in one direction or the other. We're just displaying it in what we think is going to be a better way for you to look at it, so you don't have to pull up your inbound, outbound volume and compare them on a chart to see how they're changing. We've just created one index.
Right. So the Seattle market is in a negative state just about the entire year. We are, like I said, we are in the dev site, so there is a little bit of limitation here, so I can't show you exactly the entire length of time, but as of tonight at 10 p.m., you will have a full view of this index starting at March 1st. So you see here that it's in a negative state. So that means that the amount of inbounds are exceeding outbounds. If it were positive, outbounds are exceeding inbounds. And with inbounds exceeding outbounds in Seattle, you have what is the definition of a backhaul market. So you don't have a high likelihood of getting out of the Seattle market at this particular time. What would be interesting, though, is kind of seeing how close this does get back up to zero. So any one of these spikes right here, Seattle is actually a lot more volatile than even I kind of figured. But each one of these kind of movements up actually correlates a little bit. It actually leads tender rejections a little bit by like a few days or so. So it goes back to the idea that volume kind of leads the market, leads instability. I think I made the analogy last week about a balloon, the freight market. The more volume you put into that balloon, the likelihood of it popping gets higher. And that's essentially what's happening here. So when you have a dramatic inflow of volume into a market, you are probably going to experience some sort of the potential for destabilization at any given point. Each time one of these surges of outbound kind of came in, we saw tender rejections kind of go up. So I'll go ahead and pull up the OTRI Seattle. I'm going to take off this baseline study a little bit. So I'm just going to turn that into a mountain. There we go. So zooming out a little bit, and you can see each one of these bumps actually correlates, and they actually lead. I'm going to actually try to throw up the, see if it'll, there we go. So I've got the Hall Seattle put up here, and you can see each one of these kind of bumps actually predates some of these bumps and tender rejections, and these dips also kind of get in front of where the dips and tender rejections are as well. And all that is just the market kind of, it reacts, it normalizes, people actually figure out, okay, there's some freight in the area, and then it goes back to a more equalized state. This to me is insanely valuable in both broker and asset management. Now, asset managers obviously have a huge use for this in the way that they can go, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up the map, because I think that's always a good place to kind of start understanding an index. So I'm going to pull up the head haul index on the map, and each one of these dark blue spots is going to have a higher head haul index value. So a higher like positive value more than likely, because anytime you're going to have a lot more freight coming out than in, you're going to have that darker blue. So a 50 value is going to have a darker blue than a 20 value, for instance. Or Seattle, again, strangely enough, not the widest value on the map, but you have Miami down here, another traditional kind of backhaul market scenario, more freight coming out than going in. I'm sorry, strike that, reverse it. Yeah. There's not a lot of freight available. So essentially, if I'm a load planner and I'm thinking about I've got a load that's going to the Memphis market, I can feel very confident that I'm going to be able to get my truck moving, because to me, as a asset manager, I'm thinking about, am I going to keep my trucks moving? Utilization is a big deal for me. As a broker, I'm going to start looking for these situations where that line was changing. So essentially, as the market moves towards or away from equilibrium, I'm really interested in what that movement's doing to the overall market. That means that volume itself is kind of increasing in that area. To illustrate that a little bit more clearly, I'm going to go ahead and go back to the chart.
And I think one thing to note here as well, when talking about this index and talking about, attributing head haul, back haul, is that it's not necessarily indicative of price. So just because we have a region with a higher spread, if you will, or higher volume of outbound as opposed to inbound volume, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be a higher rate.
Yeah, and that's true. Anytime basically what you're trying to use this for is you're trying to gain insight into the volatility of the market. That's the whole purpose of SONAR, is to give you a heads up. So the idea here is that you're going to see something at the very beginnings of its action. It may blossom into something that turns the market on its head, or it may just kind of be a quick blip on the radar and then it fizzles. Now, these tools are there to help you kind of see which ones are making the biggest, strongest movements in the market. One of the things that I do, I look at 1 week, 2 week, and monthly changes. The 1 week changes are obviously in their infancy. The 2 week changes are going to have a lot more kind of weight to them. So they're going to be the ones that you're going to take more significant, as more seriously. The monthly changes, the problem there is that you may have already missed your window to take advantage of a situation. But those are going to be your strongest indicators that the market has changed or turned in some sort of way. This will eventually have that weekly, monthly change feature added to it, like we have on the other indexes, like the OTRI-W, OTRI-F, OTRI-M, tender volume changes and stuff like that. And we're going to get into those a little bit later in the show, just to make sure that everybody knows exactly how to manage through some of these situations like the holiday and whatnot. But I think you saw me clicking on the map while Brad was talking. So I wanted to kind of point out too that, this 75 may not have any meaning to you right now. But eventually, as you look through some of these and click through some of them, you're going to be able to kind of get a little bit of insight. So you can already see, like, 75 is probably a very high value in terms of the head haul index. That means that they are experiencing significant outbound over inbound situation. So eventually that market is going to run out of trucks, or you're going to have a deadhead situation there if you're a load planner. And that's something that I'm keeping in mind, is because they're essentially going to run out of trucks in the area. You can position your truck there if you can get a load into it. And I would probably lower my rates if I'm a broker going into that market, or even if I have that kind of access and an asset situation. If I'm a pricing guy at a truckload carrier, I'm looking at this all the time, trying to figure out how to set my pricing appropriately. These places that have high head haul index values are the ones that I'm going to consider lowering my rates a little bit more to get into those markets, because that's going to keep my trucks moving. These places with these low values, Austin, Texas, for instance, has a negative 47 value. So you can kind of already see, even though you don't really know right away what a 47 and a 73 and a 60 is, you can already kind of gain a little bit of understanding of what these numbers are as you go into these markets in terms of and clicking on the map values. A negative 79, pretty aggressive. That means that there is just not, a lot of freight coming out in relation to going in. And those are the places that I'm going to keep my truck out of, or I'm going to price it obviously appropriately. I don't think anybody needs to know I need to price Miami higher going in, but there's going to be periods of time, where Miami actually becomes more appealing. There's going to be more freight available. The Mother's Day flower situation, for instance, that we talked about on here a few times. You have these 2-week periods of time where you can actually take advantage of something that a lot of the market doesn't already know. And that's really what the value of this is that you're going to get a heads up on the stuff that nobody else really knows. You're going to see these volumes moving before the rates move, before the brokers, before the carriers even understand what's happening. You're going to get some insight into what's happening in the market itself, especially in these isolated pockets. To me, it's very fascinating to look at the Dallas market and see how it kind of the number kind of bounces around, because the Dallas market is very fickle. It can go up and down because it has a lot of different factors moving in the Dallas market in terms of the volume coming from LA and the West Coast and the volume coming from the East Coast. It's, any of these markets that are in the middle of the country have heavy rail presence. So the intermodal volumes and things like that are going to suck capacity at times. You're going to have commodity flows, a lot of distribution centers in Dallas, a lot of market volatility, if you will, in terms of volume. I'll go ahead and I was going to pull up the chart again I'll go ahead and pull up Dallas. What do you think, Brad?
Yeah, I think Dallas is a good one to look at, especially when talking about the haul index and kind of some of the local regional moves that they have, as well as long haul.
Yeah.
To see how it's operating and see how specifically tender rejections and that's a good kind of comparison function to use some of the lane specific tender rejections. So as you see this head haul index, and as we mentioned, it can be very predictive of the tender rejections. You can actually drill in to lane specific and see, okay, what is being affected by this increase or decrease in volume? Where is the increase? Where are these loads going via tender rejection?
Yeah, exactly. So again, this is a good example. I'm just going to go ahead and take that off because it's hard for me to look at. So Dallas, my point with Dallas was essentially that the volume, and again, we're on our development site, so some of these aren't working as cleanly as I'd like them to. But as of tonight, 10 p.m., this should all be clean and on the regular SONAR page. So something to look at here, the tender, basically the outbound exceeded the inbound and Dallas significantly throughout the month of May into June. You got produce season having a lot of trucks coming across the country. You had this huge surge of container volume and everything hitting the ports. Volumes kind of spiked, which led tender rejections as well. Like we had this brief little dip around the end of May, and actually tender rejections stayed elevated through that period of time. And you didn't see the market kind of understand that until later, especially in the LA to Dallas rate coming off the West Coast. So the point here is you're looking at balance and potential opportunities in a market that are more likely to have imbalance. And Dallas, to me, is one of those markets that has high opportunity for imbalance. It's dropped all the way back down to 51.84 as the amount of inbound is starting to kind of regulate the market. There's more inbound coming in versus outbound. The market itself is actually kind of stabilizing. The rest of the country is kind of stabilizing right now a little bit. We have seen some volumes pick up here in the last week or so. But if I'm looking at a day-to-day basis, where am I going to move my trucks? I'm looking for a place with high head haul value. If I'm a broker, I'm looking for anything that has one of these in it, one of these big jumps or potentially one of these big dips, because that's how I'm going to start thinking about changing my rates accordingly, just to make sure that that carrier doesn't turn around and start trying to tell me, hey, I don't have a truck in the area. And you can go to the next carrier and say, hey, you're going to have high likelihood that somebody's going to have a truck in the market because the inbounds coming in the ratio of that to the outbound is getting tighter and smaller. Therefore, you can rely on the market to be in a better situation. So I think we covered head haul pretty well.
Yeah.
I think we want to talk about some other things that we're potentially adding. We're adding some new tender rejection capabilities by market. So I think a lot of people have had this, have at least played with this length of haul. Do you want to kind of intro length of haul while I get it set up real fast?
For those familiar, they've had it at the national level. So they've had local, what we define as local, short haul, mid haul, tweener, and long haul tender rejection. We've now created them for each specific region, and they're actually defined, of course, in the knowledge center of SONAR. But for a quick reference, our local tender reject index measures rejections with an origin point in, for this example, Harrisburg, PA, under 100 miles in length of haul. Then our short haul is going to be 100 to 250. Our mid is going to be 250 to 499. And our tweener is going to be that kind of middle 500 to 800 range. And then our long haul is going to be 800 plus.
That's right.
And again, that's all available. The exact mileage is available in the knowledge center under the length of haul indices, and they're as we mentioned, they're available for every geographical region now. Which what can this tell us, I guess, and how can this be used? Because I know it's not lane specific like some of our OD pairs from a rejection percentage, but what can we use this information for, and how is it helpful?
So this is actually a really kind of I was surprised by how interested I was in this after I got into the markets and started looking at each one. Each market actually has its own fingerprint of what kind of freight that it prefers to haul. And I guess intuitively I knew that just from my own experience. But to see it kind of expressed in data form, I can now get a better idea of how each market treats its regional freight versus its super regional freight versus its over the road freight, and your long haul freight. I'm actually kind of shocked, to see this S-Tri value, which is the 100 to 250 mile stuff, be rejected more in that area. And I guess when I thought it through, in Harrisburg, you're talking about the Northeast, and the Northeast is of course a regional market. Once you get up there, you're kind of stuck bouncing around the Northeast for a little while until you can get the load to get you back out. So the S-Tri people are probably up there kind of saying, okay, I don't want to go to Boston, or, that's not in the S-Tri. That's actually more in the mid-Tri, I think. But again, you see mid-Tri kind of closely follows the S-Tri up there. So these regional moves, people are saying, no, I don't want to go that direction. I want to go the other way, kind of get out of this corridor, get me to Atlanta. Florida, for instance, is probably even a decent way to get out of there. But
that's interesting that their long haul is at the lowest rejection percentage for the region. Why do you think that is, and what do you...
You've got this rail presence up there too. So, the rail is going to suck up a lot of volume out of that market, especially anything that's going across the country. Anything going from east to west, you're probably going to put it on the rail out of there because you have a big rail presence. Things even going to Chicago, for instance, may go on the rail over there. Big intermodal. You got Newark right there, the port, the second largest port, well, I guess the third largest port in the country, next to Long Beach and LA. So there's going to be a lot of intermodal presence. And so that L-Tri kind of gives you an idea of what the rail volatility is right now as well. So when you see those tender rejections go higher on the L-Tri out of an area like Harrisburg, you can kind of glean some information on what's going on the rail and the ports and stuff like that, because some of that volume is going to spill over into your contract freight market. Mm-hmm. It's going to suck capacity up just like anything else that comes in and without enough capacity to take care of it. Each market has its own fingerprint like this, like I said. So once you kind of have an understanding of what is in these mileage bands, which I don't think a lot of people need to spend a lot of time learning. I think most of us kind of understand intuitively that have been in the market for a little while what they mean. I should probably pull up another example. Yeah, what region do you think would be a good one to kind of look at?
I think
LA?
Dallas or LA. Yeah.
LA?
LA would probably be interesting because you'd have Northern California.
Let's see what it looks like in LA. If you want to talk about things while I type, because I can't talk and type at the same time. I think we've established that.
So I think short haul is going to encompass your Northern California runs. Your tweener is going to be things like Salt Lake City. Long haul is going to be, Portland, Seattle, Dallas, Denver, and of course further out than there, Phoenix will fall into your short haul, Phoenix would fall into your mid haul. Your short haul is probably going to be
San Francisco's a long way away.
Yeah, that'll be mid haul as well. Your local, of course, is going to be kind of Inland Empire. Maybe get some San Diego runs in that data as well. If we're talking about LAX.
So this is actually fascinating to me now that I got it pulled up. So you've got your tweener tri, which is your 450 to 800 mile band being the worst one, and that to me is kind of like what the mountains. The Intermountain West?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be past. I mean, you may have a few LA to NorCal runs that'll be a little bit over 450, but not many. That would have to be a pretty long one. But yeah, I think you're going to have Salt Lake City in there.
Salt Lake City. I think Denver's too far. I think that's in your long range.
Reno will probably be in there 5-ish.
So there's really not a lot of good outbound freight areas in that mileage band. So again, you kind of get a better idea of what's happening. So you can actually glean, this is going to give you a better idea of where to look once you figure out, oh my gosh, my tender rejections are going up, down in LA. Which markets are the most likely for me to like kind of attain the best rate, get my freight moving the most? Once you figure out these mileage bands, this M-Tri, for instance, M-Tri LAX is starting to go up in relation to the T-Tri. The M-Tri is going to be 250 to 450 miles. So anything in that range. If you're a regional carrier, I'm jumping in there and trying to take care of my truck.
Yeah, especially because I think a lot of regional carriers may not specifically, they may go to Northern California, to Las Vegas, to Phoenix, and to have him. And there's that lane data is available as well in here because of the amount of volume. So you can also, compare with how maybe the mid haul or short haul is comparing with specific lanes. Because I know you can definitely put in LA to Stockton and LA to Phoenix and see what those rejection percentages and how they compare to that length of haul.
So I think now that we've introduced kind of our new lane or our new tickers in here, I kind of want to incorporate them into like a day-to-day kind of use. How do I use all this information? I mean, there's I think we've all, if again, for those of you, and we forgot to mention this in the beginning, if you are new to SONAR, at your first couple of days or whatnot, please go to the Knowledge Center, which is located in this question mark right here. Click on that. That'll take you to the website. You'll have access to the entire Knowledge Center of SONAR itself. There's links to articles, videos, webinars, previous webinars, all the index definitions. We're constantly adding new stuff to make this more useful, to make it easier for everybody to use. We try to keep everybody as up to date as possible as the data comes in, and our data team kind of works through some of these indexes and makes sure that they are relevant. So if you need a little bit more clarification for you new users, please go to that site and click through there. There should be plenty of information. And if that isn't enough, then just call Brad personally on his cell phone, and he'll be glad to answer all your questions. But yeah, the SONAR sales team is always available to kind of help anybody with kind of their first use situation. This is a little bit more advanced, but we've kind of progressed through that 101 period. So I think what I want to do next, Brad, is kind of start from the beginning and just go into what do I do? What do I do day one? I'm gonna go ahead and just clear out the screen. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the map. And I kind of want to get an idea of what's going on in the market. So we've talked about these weekly changes and market changes. You're going to pick the ones that are most relevant to you, depending on what kind of background you're in. We try to talk to the kind of the highest level and the broadest audience on these webinars, but I'm going to have to kind of be a little bit more specific. So I think what I want to do is talk today about kind of a broker, from a broker aspect, and see how can I make the most money today as a freight broker using SONAR. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and look at any kind of significant market share changes. Because what the market share change is going to tell me, it's going to be an indication of volume, but it's also going to tell me about movement, freight movement in general. And we just had a holiday, so our volume is going to be a little bit depressed this week. So that's why I'm not using that, and I probably should go through that here in a minute.
Yes.
But the market share is a relational value. So what that means is anytime that a market starts having more loads coming out of it or in it, depending on your perspective, I'm going to look at the outbound tender market share here in a second, just to kind of give a quick start, because what I'm trying to do is figure out where can I take advantage of rate pressure. I want to have the most pricing leverage as a broker, but I also want to know what the carrier's thinking. So I'm going to take that top-down approach and say, outbound tender market share, weekly change, because I want the quickest value possible. So Atlanta has started taking more of the market share. So I know that market probably has some volume coming out of it. St. Louis, again, another dark blue market share. I can look down through here and I can see, the head haul index value is 58. That means there's a lot of, I think we learned that anything higher than probably 50 is a pretty heavy. The head haul index out of Atlanta is only 23.
I think that's something important to quickly go over, is how market share is different from head haul and how head haul uses the outbound inbound volume. So just to kind of explain how, being that, we're looking at the market share being, kind of 100% of that pie in every region on the map, getting a percentage of that, just because Atlanta is gaining the most market share, it may not necessarily mean that they're actually vastly increasing their outbound volume as much as the regions surrounding or the rest of the country may be decreasing in volume. So maybe I just stole your thunder, but
you did a little bit.
I did. I'm sorry.
I'm not upset about it though.
Well, you can maybe continue on.
Yeah, you can. No, that's perfect. Anytime you jump in, I think you probably can speak to it a little bit more succinctly than me at times. So kind of the difference between market share and volume. So volume is going to give you this idea of overall volume. So as the OTVI goes up, that's kind of like this absolute measure of volume increasing. Mm-hmm. What it's not telling you is it increasing in relation to the rest of the country? Is it increasing just overall? Like that's really what it is. If that value goes up, the overall volume of that market is going up. When the OTMS, the market share goes up, that's telling you that it's going up in relation to the country itself. So
you have a higher probability to get a load.
Yes. Out of that region. Yes, you have a lot higher probability of getting the load out of the region. Whereas the other case does not necessarily mean that. And what the head haul index tells you is it's going to come over the top of that and say, all right, you are actually way out of balance. Your inbound, and it's quickly going to tell you that your inbound is so deficient and your outbound is over sufficient. So you're going to have this oversupply where you're going to have an undersupply potentially as that value gets higher of trucks, because your inbound volume is going to be depressed. Your outbound volume is going to be increasing. Right. So Atlanta, even though it's taking more market share, I can tell right here that its inbound volume is actually probably coming up with it at the same time. 23 value, again, just having looked at this map for a second and kind of picking out that head haul map value, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania had a 75. So I know that essentially Atlanta is not that destabilized, or potentially not that destabilized right now. They're just seeing a surge of volume in relation to the country. So I'm going to go over here to St. Louis. I'm going to look at St. Louis because it's got a higher value of 58. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and dig deeper into St. Louis and try to figure out what can I figure out about St. Louis right now. And then the first thing I'm going to do is check out my tender rejections. Tender rejections not going up in St. Louis. Well, that's to me, that's kind of like, okay, so they have not destabilized in St. Louis very much yet. They're way down over the course of the past few weeks. Again, we just had a holiday.
And you were looking at market share monthly change.
Yes.
So you're looking at the past month.
Oh, did I pull the market share monthly?
Yes.
Oh, so I accidentally did that. I didn't even do it right, did I?
No.
Wow.
Okay.
Maybe I should start over.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually kind of a happy accident because I can kind of clearly illustrate here with St. Louis's outbound tender rejection index that St. Louis is in a really good space right now. They did have this big surge in the month of August. That's not exactly what we saw in the rest of the country in terms of tender rejections. I'm going to go ahead and kind of compare. So St. Louis would have been a good market to kind of get a heads up on in the month of August as they had some destabilization. Tender rejections shot up at the first of the month, and now they have quickly retreated. So that market itself is looking pretty good. So I'm going to start this over again and just start back from the beginning real fast as I picked the wrong index. Way to go.
You wanted weekly, right?
Yeah, I wanted weekly. How about tender market share weekly? Again, that's St. Louis. Showing that heated. Okay.
Yep,
all right. So I figured out St. Louis. Maybe it's not necessarily it hasn't destabilized yet, but I'm actually going to pay attention to it because it was the weekly change. With volumes basically exceeding the outbound volumes exceeding the inbound volumes quite a bit. I'm actually paying attention to St. Louis for any kind of surges in volume itself. So I'm going to just go back and do that again.
Yeah. Well, they had a huge surge in outbound volume leading up to the holiday. So, and you'll see that if you compare outbound inbound, which is
so here, you see that the volume in St. Louis actually went up. So I've pulled up the outbound tender volume index, and I see clearly that we have had a surge of volume come through the pipeline. Tender rejections did not reflect that right away, but I am paying attention to this place in terms of figuring out what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the OTRI St. Louis, and I'm going to try to isolate where my best opportunities for rate pressure are from a broker's perspective. And with our new C-try and S-try, I'm going to go ahead and try to isolate where my best chances in terms of the regional market are. Yeah. You want to talk through that real quick?
No, definitely. And I mean, being that St. Louis is a pretty small X market, your local or your C-try less than 100 miles is going to be pretty closely represented though of just within that St. Louis, and your short haul is probably going to be maybe we'll see some Indiana, Southern Illinois, some really, I wouldn't say any major markets. I'd say in the mid haul is where you start to get there with Chicago and Kansas City in terms of the bigger surrounding markets. So it'll be interesting to see, and even into tweener. So it'll be interesting to see what are we looking at here? So mid haul.
So mid hauls appear to be the fingerprint in St. Louis. Now, what I actually see here is back here in May or June. Yeah, back in May, we had a big surge of short haul tender rejections. So that's going to help you isolate. You know, when you're checking out your map every day and you're trying to find your big swings in market pressure, if you go in here and you start kind of breaking down the lane itself, you're going to see, okay, now I can isolate. I can figure out exactly where my biggest opportunity for rate pressure are. And this short haul market back here in middle of May had some big opportunities. We're not seeing a lot right now, but if I'm a carrier or a broker as I think we're supposed to be isolated to the
Yeah.
broker. So if I'm a broker, I'm starting to put my mileage band on my map, and I'm going to isolate where my mid haul is, and that's where I'm going to put my highest rates. And then I'm going to go down here and find, well, what's my easiest one? Well, the local. That makes sense. So your local driver, you don't really need anybody to tell you that's going to be an easy picking. But sometimes you see these big surges like we saw right here just a few weeks ago. There's a big local volume push. And you can now take advantage of that. And you know that that market is now, there's less demand or there's less supply for the local truck than there is demand for it. And that's what the tender rejection is trying to measure, is the supply demand equilibrium.
Yeah, let's add another tab here and just show how much further you can go into. And we looked at the length of haul. Now let's look specific. Let's pull up a few lanes and see what may be driving.
Because we're on a small screen, let's go ahead. So we had M-Tri is kind of our big winner. So we're going to go here and we're going to start pulling out lanes. So St. Louis, Mid-Tri, Chicago.
Should be a good one. We have a Kansas City or Missouri or something like that.
Yep, St. Louis to Missouri, or Kansas City is it's probably a little bit
so that's
short.
One right there.
There we go. Kansas City. Looks like Kansas City was kind of the big reason that we had this big push back here. Again, makes a lot of sense. And a lot of these are pretty local. Rockford, Illinois. Again, they're not going to show up on here unless you have enough volume to substantiate there being enough statistical relevance.
It's still interesting to see what that's still going to show what's driving that outbound market.
So I'm a broker and I've now kind of isolated, all right, my best chance, St. Louis to MCI, pretty short drive. Yeah. But I now know that there's going to be more opportunity there for me to capture some of this rate pressure. We obviously have not figured out exactly what was pushing all of this. Kansas City was a big winner here, but now I'm going to go to my load boards and kind of I'm going to know that it's not going to be Rockford, Illinois, or Chicago that I'm looking for. Which Chicago is probably the biggest lane out of St. Louis, outside of the local.
Also desirable to get back to, especially over the past couple months in comparison to the rest of the country. Let's see if there's any equipment specific driving the St. Louis market. So we've kind of drilled down to mid-haul.
So now let's look at
Kansas City, potentially specific.
R-Tri St. Louis. Well, we know it wasn't reefers here.
Yeah.
Right now, if you wanted to get a reefer out of St. Louis, that now would be the time to do it. It looks like that might actually be a big reason why they're getting this volume push.
Looks like it.
So you've got some opportunity in reefer right now, as we just figured out. So now I figured out that St. Louis has this need for reefers. I've had this big volume push over the last week. What's trying to get out of St. Louis right now? Kansas City has some opportunity in it. Reefers have some opportunity in it. I'm looking at my load board, trying to pick out some of these loads. I'm making sure that I have enough pricing on my, if I'm getting a call from a customer in St. Louis, this is where kind of that targeted approach for your business kind of makes the most sense. This is what's going to complement what you're seeing on your customer side. So the shipper calls in from St. Louis. He's like, I got 10 loads coming out over the next few days. I go to the map. I see that St. Louis is seeing a pretty big increase in volume. I now know to watch out. I add some percentage points to my rates to make sure that it's like, I got you covered. I can actually see that the market's a little bit in disarray. The equilibrium, the head haul index is a little bit high. Add a few more percentage points to my rate. And now I go and start working the carrier side.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And let's pull up too. And one thing I want to mention though is we have the outbound tender reject index, St. Louis. So that's a pure percentage. So that's measuring an absolute percentage of loads being rejected with origin point St. Louis. And we're also showing a rejection percentage with the green line here in St. Louis to Kansas City. And we're also showing an absolute rejection percentage with the reefer. So why I'm bringing this up is that you can view them all together on a chart. and there's no need to change to, kind of just a user functionality
Mm-hmm.
point, that there's no need to change to your display to a relative mode. But if you are doing some of these chart comparisons, make sure that you understand the y-axis value of what you're comparing so that you get accurate, an accurate picture of what's happening.
Yeah.
But sorry. And then can you throw up van too to see what the van specific is doing out of that region?
VTRI St. Louis. VTRI is pretty close to the actual value. Reefers do have some opportunity in it, though.
Yeah.
Looks like the majority of this market's moving on the VTRI, though.
Yeah.
As would most.
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, I like that. That was
Mm-hmm.
that was good. And actually, one more thing that I know we talked about this before, that we don't talk about enough, I don't think. And I don't think it's a great, or not a great, sorry, I don't think it's very helpful to look at on its own, but the tender lead time, I think, is an extremely helpful tool when doing a market analysis, or when looking at a region, to understand. We talk so much about rejection percentage, lane specific, and what is the reaction from, the carrier side, or accept, reject, do they not have a truck? Is the pricing incorrect? So this gives us a little better picture of what exactly, showing the tender lead time we haven't talked about it in a while. So maybe you want to reintroduce it and say what this could tell you and what it's done. This looks like the volatility of what's been created by this mid-haul / reefer injection into the St. Louis market. What is this specifically telling you?
So the tender lead time is really kind of valuable from a shipper standpoint. It's going to tell you exactly how long I need to expect in each market to kind of, give my carrier enough time to accept the load. I'm going to have the highest chances of getting load acceptance when I'm up here, the higher the tender lead time. Of course, there's a lot of load dispatchers that will not, or fleet managers that will not even worry about your freight outside of 2 days.
Right.
Like if you're 2 days ahead of the schedule, like they're probably going to sit on it for a little while as well. So it's not necessarily a great thing, but anytime you have a higher lead time, it gives the carrier more opportunity to accept your load first. You're going to be in front of everything. I think everybody kind of inherently understands that. But each market has its own kind of tender lead time fingerprint. Let's go ahead and pull up Atlanta versus. So you see the tender lead time in Atlanta is actually, in general, way lower than St. Louis. St. Louis is experiencing this large decrease in tender lead time, and is now and Atlanta actually is seeing a large increase in tender lead time. So that's pretty interesting to me whenever you see these large movements like that. So tender lead time doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see a huge spike in volume or a huge decrease in volume. What it's going to tell you is essentially, this is basically what the shipper behavior is. Like they're anticipating getting their load covered with ease. You're going to see this flat tender lead time. It's going to stay right in line with the rest of the market. When you see these big spikes in tender lead time, it's telling me the shipper thinks, I need to get this out there for a reason. And most of the time, it's volume. They're thinking that they need to make sure that their loads are covered, or this is a more important freight movement than I normally have. So anytime this moves like this, I'm actually going to go and look in Atlanta and start trying to check out, okay, did we get some volume in Atlanta, et cetera. In St. Louis, it makes me think that market actually has the information that the shippers at least are comfortable thinking that they're going to get their loads out there in plenty of time.
No, I think it's a good one. I know we don't talk about it too much, but I just think it's a really good kind of a surrounding data set to look at alongside with a lot of the tender related stuff. So I encourage those Sonar users on here to do so. I encourage those on here that are not Sonar users to become Sonar users. And you can do so by contacting us at sales@freightwaves.com or going to our website, www.freightwaves.com/sonar. We're kind of closing things out here the last 10 minutes. We'd like to open up for questions for any of those that we've had so far or that we potentially will have. We have just a few minutes to do so. A little more housekeeping. We do have, as Zach mentioned, we've been mainly in the QA site, our kind of test site, because we are launching the head haul index tonight, amongst a few other things on the horizon or that will be coming out in the next week. We will have actually the tender rejection outbound and inbound for 12, is it 12 or 11 Canadian
I think it's
regions? 11
Mhm.
Canadian regions. So you'll kind of our first expansion outside of the US and showing, and yeah, if you want to pull one up for those that are
They all
watching.
start with Y.
Yeah, so it can be defined as O-try, same as you would any other tender rejection, but they start with a Y, as Zach mentioned, to note that they're in Canada, and those are now available, and those will be showing cross-border in these rejection numbers and also intra-Canada. So some good stuff there. And the regions, stay tuned for the exact regions. They're not province specific. They are a little bit, they're similar to the X market regions that have been created here in Sonar. So keep an eye out for that. And also for those on the webinar here that are not yet Sonar users, we sent out our first shipment of our 34-inch LG widescreen curve monitors to our Sonar users, getting some really good feedback, and they're loving viewing Sonar on these screens. That promotion is still available for you to take advantage of through the end of the month here, September 30th, with each annual subscription to Sonar, you'll receive one of those screens. So take advantage of that if you are on the fence or interested in a Sonar subscription. And I think we actually don't have any questions, which Zach is very sad, and I'm gonna have to console him that no one wants to hear him talk anymore for the rest of the webinar. Oh, we do have one that just came in, and we have, I'm a new broker. Is this tool something that will benefit me now, or do I need to wait until I have a lot of customers? I think I would naturally answer this could potentially help you get customers because you have a better insight into how markets are reacting to volume and capacity changes. So you'll have a better idea or better reasoning behind how you quote freight. Do you need to be higher? Do you need to be lower? Do you need to be competitive, I guess is the right term in certain markets? And are you going to be able to cover the freight in other markets? So I think it's definitely probably a really good tool for your day-to-day or week-to-week use as a small individual broker.
Oh man,
Because
I think it's going to be, yeah. I mean, you're going to get a lot more value out of it as you're building your kind of
Right.
business, because this is how you're going to get your leg up on the big guys, because they're going to have a lot of their own kind of information.
Right. Internal data.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, they're going to be kind of, bound to that internal data. And you're going to have this insight into the larger picture as you're getting more comfortable with which markets to kind of target, which ones are on fire, which ones cool off. Right now, we're in kind of this cooling, stabilized kind of environment right now. So this would actually be more important to the person that does not have the exposure to the rest of the country like the bigger guys do. So it'll help you kind of be more focused in what your approach is on a day-to-day.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I think you can look at it both sides, that this gives you a picture of the entire market. And if you're one of these larger shippers, carriers, or brokers as well, you can kind of use this information as somewhat of a benchmark and see, when you talk about the amount of internal data that some of your larger brokers, carriers, shippers have, being able to use this tool to see some of the external factors, some of the things that are happening outside of your own organization or surrounding regions to where you typically ship or move assets. Really valuable stuff there. There's something in here for everyone, I think, that's involved in freight transactions. So yes, absolutely, or we wouldn't be here.
Right.
And I think we may have one more question that came in. Yeah, so we don't have one more. So if that's it, we'll hang on here for. Are there any plans to do add a load to truck ratio in the future?
And add a load to truck ratio.
Within SONAR?
Not that I know of.
Not that we know of. That typically is going to be, correct me if I'm wrong, more of kind of a load posting or kind of a load dashboard type of tool. That's not, I would say nothing's impossible or that we won't.
It's not going to be in the near term.
It's not going to be in the near term, and it's not something that's on our current, let's say that it's not something that's currently on our board of upcoming things to add.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll stay on mute here for the next few minutes until 2 o'clock. So until 3 o'clock, excuse me. So if we do have any additional questions, please feel free to ask. Again, sales@freightwaves.com is our team email here, our SONAR team. Also the website, www.freightwaves.com/SONAR. You can access us there if you forgot the SONAR team email. So thank you again for joining us. If we don't have any more questions, we're going to sign off, but we'll stay live here for a few more minutes in case we have questions trickle in. All right, we don't have any further questions, so we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you again for joining us for the weekly SONAR Insights webinar. Again, stay tuned for new updates. And if you have any questions, one more time, sales@freightwaves.com is our email, and you can also go to our website to request a demo. www.freightwaves.com/SONAR. Zach and Brad signing off. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good week.